The bottom line is I like to type. Thank you very much for coming out today. And I was wondering if it was going to rain on me, and I was thinking I shouldn't be worried about that because it's Henry David Thoreau and you're Richard Olkin. And that you shouldn't worry about such things. And my wife loves to tweak, because she has tolerated Henry Thoreau around the house for 2 years while I was working on the book. She's taken to tweaking famous Thoreauvian quotations, such as, beware of enterprises that require new clothes. So she says, beware of enterprises that require new clothes unless it's a frilly little skirt you already had your eye on. And so now she makes me very self-conscious when I'm thinking about things like, I'm worried about where's my blazer when I'm going to give a talk on Henry David Thoreau. Thank you very much to the Concord Bookshop, a wonderful bookstore that I've been in several times in the past. I did not return to Concord while I was actually writing this book because I wanted to keep the 19th century in my head, not the 21st century. And so I was completely immersed in the primary sources of the era and had John Roman's fabulous sort of three-dimensional aerial view of Concord on July 4th, 1845, the actual day that Henry moved into the cabin. I kept that on the wall beside my desk and was completely surrounded by the atmosphere of the mid-19th century. So I was afraid to come here because I was afraid a parking lot might ruin it for me. Very first thing, I would like to address the pronunciation of his name. Locals and family members and scholars, well, there aren't any family members now, know that he was born David Henry Thoreau, and the accent on the first syllable. And people, readers of his to begin with, pronounced it Thoreau if they didn't know him or know the area because it looks French, and it turns out it was. His family was from Jersey, the French-dominated island in the Channel. So they were only 2 generations away from the pronunciation as Thoreau and had changed it here. So I just don't think it matters very much, and I slip in and out of it. If we learned tomorrow that Ernest Hemingway pronounced his name actually Hemingway, very few of us would bother to do that. And so I tend to go in and out of the pronunciation, I think in part depending on who I'm talking to. If I know they know more about it, I try to say Thoreau. Having spent intimate up-close time with him for 2 years, as I said, I tend to call him Henry. And the book is a very close-up, personal, almost novel-like look at his early years. And by novel-like, I don't mean anything fictional at all, just very textured and detailed and a lot of dialogue from the primary sources. So throughout the book, I call him Henry. No doubt I'll fall into that. So I need to start appropriately with a quotation by Ralph Waldo Emerson, who said of his old friend, he was free and strange. And the one thing I keep coming back to was Henry was very, very strange. And that was the exciting part of this for me, was the personality and character and getting that on paper. At times it felt like I was wrestling 5 gorillas into one little bitty cage, this cage. And it worked. But to me, when I look at the book, it almost vibrates with the tension of getting all those different characters and personalities into the same book. A lot of people come down on one side or the other or feel they ought to. They become a Thoreau idolater or acolyte, or they decide that they're a critic of his or an enemy of his, that he was a fraud in some way or whatever. I just felt no urge to do that. I don't have an axe to grind of any kind. I'm just interested in the reality. He was a very important writer to me, beginning in my teen years, and hugely influential in my life. But I just am not interested in hero worship any more than I'm interested in trashing him or showing that he had feet of clay. So I just wanted all those paradoxes in there together because that's what made it fun to write. And a great deal of his life was about various synonyms and alternative ways of saying fun. And there was a huge amount on a very deep level and on several superficial levels on an overall year-long period and on daily effort of fun in the researching and writing of the book. And I hope that shows on the page. Because Henry was a paradox. He was an ox cart tumbling full of paradoxes. And it is what makes him poignant to read about, I think. The book is sort of half joyful and half melancholy. And it makes him funny to read about because he was a very sarcastic, lively, caustic wit. So he can be very funny knowing he was. Fortunately for me as a writer and for you as a reader, he could also be funny in many ways he was totally unaware of, which is almost more interesting to write about. So in my story, because I don't have to cover his entire life and I don't have to trudge from significant accomplishment to significant accomplishment, I'm able to zoom in and focus on things, so I don't play prophet and I don't look ahead. I don't analyze or criticize or critique. I just try to convey the story as much in the era as I possibly can. And so I'm writing in an omniscient third-person voice in and out of the minds of Hawthorne and his wife and Emerson and 2 or 3 of the young children who were in the school run by Henry and his brother John. So all of those primary sources, to me, give it a lot of different texture and make it feel more alive, and brought on more characters and made it feel more like a busy little movie to do. A friend of mine said that as I talked about it, I kept saying scene instead of chapter or something like that. And he said, "Are you writing a movie or a book?" And I said, "Well, I've found so much gorgeous, fun, original material with texture that it feels like a movie at times, because there was so much dialogue written down an hour later by the participants. And they would write down what their thoughts were. Across town, somebody else would be writing a letter with their experience of the same event. And then there would be a news story telling everything about the weather and who the famous people were present at the event. So there's so much texture, dialogue, and detail that it comes alive in a way that completely captured my imagination. And I love biography, and I read biographies obsessively. And occasionally I get frustrated with some of them because they seem to forget that these people didn't know they would amount to anything. They didn't know they would become famous. They didn't know anyone would care. They certainly didn't know that anyone would be poring over their letters and diaries 150 years later, or they would have been more discreet, definitely. And you can tell when certain writers, as you do research in literature over the years, that writers reach a certain point when they think they've become important, or when they've signed over to donate their paper somewhere, their correspondence gets more cautious, which is very interesting and then disappointing. So they had none of that at the time. So there's a great deal of lively critique of each other, a lot of people participating in a gathering and then going home and saying, oh, I'm sure he means well, but he's an idiot, or whatever. And so all of those details make it come alive in a beautiful way for me. And I kept thinking and reminding myself, these people did not even know, just like us, just like everyone in this room, if they would get through the day. They didn't know if they would live until tomorrow. They certainly had no glimpse of ever being important. And so I wanted to include in this book something that I think occasionally disappears from biographical writing, which is the thing that keeps us getting up every morning and looking ahead: suspense. If you don't already know the details of Henry Thoreau's life, I think you're going to be surprised about every 5 pages, because there's so much more to him than I encountered in high school, when basically you're offered and I loved my high school teachers and I loved the English courses, and I don't mean any critique of that, but a lot of times these people, like in the Norton Anthology of Literature, you're presented the work, but at the same time you're expected to sort of nicely pat the marble bust of the icon. And I didn't want to dust off the icon. I felt that had been done plenty of times. I wanted to try to find Henry before he was Thoreau, before he was later Thoreau, before he was the patron saint of environmentalism and civil liberties, and certainly the man who best expressed, I think, for the 19th century, the sense of how do you live a life in which you have self-respect and a sense of worth, and you have your own direction, but you're participating in the world at the same time. And I think no one else in that era expressed all of those things so well. So I was working on the proposal for a different book, which I don't need to talk about here because it didn't come to pass, when I was reading the diaries of Sophia Peabody Hawthorne, who married Nathaniel. And I bring the Hawthornes in a lot because they knew Henry quite well. And so I start with them the day they moved to Concord. And I wanted them in part because they offer a different view than Emerson's view of Henry, but also because they come in after the story's been going for a while, and also because they're deeply in love. They're absolutely warm, fuzzy, out of focus, gaga over each other. And so that contrast with Henry's lonely life, in which he keeps having a crush on one girl or woman after another and nothing coming of it. And he was a man who Emerson's maids said that if he came through the back door